welcome. I'm Anthony Burke, a professor of environmental and international politics at UNSW in Canberra and the co-lead of UNSW's Grand Challenge on Thriving in the Anthropocene. I'll be your host today for our event on this wonderful new book, Living in the Anthropocene. This event will be recorded for those in the audience and will be available on the Grand Challenge's website sometime later this month. I'd ask all members of the audience to mute their microphones and cameras. I'm speaking from Canberra on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people, and our campuses in Sydney are on the traditional lands of the Bedigal and Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation. I pay respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who may be with us today. I acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. The UNSW Grand Challenge on Thriving in the Anthropocene was established this year as a way of connecting myriad lines of research with a new public conversation about the current and future challenges of our move into the Anthropocene. A rapidly changing climate, the loss of our biodiversity, the need to change energy systems and economies and lifestyles, to reconfigure our systems of government and security, and even to rethink what it is to be human on planet Earth are among many of the questions at stake. And we've come to believe that trying to generate a public conversation like this is a complex challenge, because arguably the systems and the symptoms of the Anthropocene touch the lives of every single person. But the science and the philosophy of the Anthropocene is often complex and technical and abstracted from the real power of the changes that are underway. How can the ways we study and write about the Anthropocene be better connected with that reality? This is where this wonderful new book has an important role. Edited by Cameron Muir, Kirsten Wiener, and Jenny Newell, and published by New South Books, Living in the Anthropocene connects us directly with the emotions and the fears and the material losses of living in the Anthropocene, but equally with a struggle to find determination and hope. We're joined today by Cameron and three of the book's fabulous authors, Jane Rawson, Ellen van Neerven, and David Ritter. Cameron will introduce the book for us, and Jane, Ellen, and David will each read a short excerpt from their chapters. After that, I'll be hosting a discussion with our guests, and we'd very much like the audience to be a part of this. So if you have a question for any or all of the authors, please do type them into the chat and hopefully we can get to them. So let me begin by introducing Cameron. Cameron is a writer, editor, and researcher. His writing has appeared in Griffith Review, Meandrin Overland, and the Best Australian Science Writing, amongst other publications. Cameron's work has been shortlisted in the New South Wales Premier's Literary History Awards, the Eureka Prize for Science Journalism, and the Bragg UNSW Press Prize for Science Writing. Cameron will introduce the book for us.
Thanks, Tony. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal, Ngambri and Naraga people on whose land I'm speaking from, recognise their continuing connection and care for country here, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And Tony, we're extremely grateful and thrilled that you've included the book in the UNSW Grand Challenge. And thank you to Jess Theakstone for producing this event. Of course, a big thank you to New South and all of the authors who made this book. It's a fantastic mix with personal essays, memoir and reporting. It was a privilege to work with them. And I know some are in the audience today, and we're lucky to have three on the panel, Jane, Ellen and David. This book came about because as curators and writers, Kirsten, Jenny and I had been speaking to different communities about the environmental changes they were experiencing in their local places, about dying rivers, plastic pollution, changing backyard birds, legacies of dispossession, but also making homes for insects, regenerating paddocks, renewing creeks, and finding ways to have hope. And many said they felt frustrated, and at times some people said they felt alone. And we thought it would help to know that there are other people experiencing these things, that there are other people who care. And in fact, there are lots all around Australia. And knowing that might provide some solace and some strength. So the book was about trying to bring some of those stories together to try and make sense of how we're feeling, what we're facing, and how to keep going, how to continue to work together to create ecologically and culturally flourishing places. We also thought the book might help readers prepare for future environmental challenges, but we didn't expect this year's events to really tragically demonstrate that those changes have arrived. We were actually working on the final copy edits as the bushfires engulfed Eastern Australia. And Jenny and her family were trapped in Cobargo at New Year's, and we lost contact with her for a few days. And many of the authors wrote to us and said they wanted to change their pieces. They need to ramp up the intensity. And we really understood that desire to respond to the catastrophic fires. But we thought it made sense to keep the book focused on everyday lives, everyday relationships and interactions with the material world, about considering the gradual and accumulative changes that occur over months, years, decades, things that often don't get attention, that can go unnoticed, especially in mainstream media, and that these are what contribute to the Anthropocene too. So the book was actually printed in March and was set to come out, and New South delayed it because of the nationwide lockdown. But as one of our contributors, Sophie Cunningham, said to us, if anything, this year's events, the bushfires and the pandemic, have made the book even more relevant. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming today, virtually, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the conversation. Tony, you're still muted.
Rookie mistake. Thanks very much, Cameron. I note from the chat we have a few of the other authors in the audience, so welcome to you. I've been reading the whole thing, and it really is one of the most powerful collections I've read for a very long time. Both just the quality of its writing and the depth of what it's exploring. Our next author is Ellen van Neerven. They are a Mununjali Ugambe writer of fiction, poetry, and non-fiction. They've published 2 award-winning poetry collections, Throat and Comfort Food, and the novel Heat and Light, which won the 2013 David Unipen Award, the 2016 New South Wales Premier's Literary Award, Indigenous Writers Prize, and it was also shortlisted for the Stella Prize. Ellen will be reading from their chapter, Pose, Your Descendants Will Be Watching.
Thanks, Tony. In 1824, organised theft of land and cultural genocide of First Nations people began on the land now known as South East Queensland, the land of the Yagara, Turrbal, Jinjibara, Yugumbe, Bunjalung, Waka Waka, Gabi Gabi, Nunakol, Jundabari, Ningi Ningi, and Yugapul nations. In June 1859, Queen Victoria of England authorised the separation of northern lands from New South Wales, establishing the new colony of Queensland. In February 2019, I moved back to live with my parents in my Meanjin, so-called Brisbane, childhood home. I come back from busy years in Naarm, so-called Melbourne. My mum and dad have been living in Mapa, so-called Alice Springs, on Aranda land for the last 6 years and have started their retirement. At first, being back is strange for all of us, but we slowly settle in. My parents give me the room underneath their house where I have a view of the bush out the back. The sun wakes me up every morning. My writing table is outside. There are changes I observe with my parents. More gira, sulphur-crested cockatoos, fly over the house, their sharp squawks impossible to ignore. I don't remember that many of them when I was last living here. a decade ago. I asked my dad and he doesn't remember this either. We remember other birds, smaller birds that we no longer see. We see fewer insects in the backyard. I have other conversations with my blackfella and people of colour friends of a similar age. We've been told that people, animals, plants, and the rest of the living must keep pace with climate change, keep evolving, keep adapting to the changing world. We speculate about the frightening changes we will observe in our lifetime. Should we have children, will it be responsible of us? Could humankind become extinct in our or their lifetimes? Should we live in a state of panic or try to enjoy the last days of the world as we know it? Which would be the most respectful to our ancestors? What would a post-human world mean in a First Nations way? As a coping strategy, we dissociate from climate crisis through music and the songs that we listen to and share. I grieve the colonization of my peoples and fear that the efforts we have taken to recover and revive our culture will be too late, as human-created environmental change has rapid effects on our land and waterways. As I learn more from my elders and peers, as Yugambeh rolls its way onto my tongue, I think, is a little I'm doing enough. Maybe that's just shame and guilt talking, two emotions so easily pushed onto a colonized people's psyche. It takes a while before I activate the real question I want to ask. How can we heal and recover from the future while at the same time preparing for a dangerous future? Can one lead to another? It does help talking to my friends, realizing that I'm having normal emotional responses to the circumstances we live in, that they also feel torn up, anxious, exhausted, and unprepared. I feel my energy scattered between the two disciplines of healing and preparing. The intergenerational conversations I have with my parents are slightly different. In the living room where we have our dinner, the TV flicks over one commercial channel to another. Segments of fish dying in the Murray-Darling Basin, 40% of insect species threatened, ocean acidification, habitat loss, floods, droughts, blizzards. I explain Dugai terms like Anthropocene, all the while knowing that Western science has never added value to Indigenous people's lives. We are creating our own language around this, my parents and I, embodied through our bushwalks. We walk at the back of the house and sometimes we fill a few water flasks and go for a drive, walk the familiar spots we used to when my brother and I were young. I'm happy to be home. I'm happy to be where my ancestors come from, belonging to this place, responsible to this place, in dialogue with this place. When the settler invaders came to the East Coast, they not only committed crimes of rape, murder, torture, and brutality to country and people, they also became narrative terrorists, a branch of terrorism that still goes strong today. The settler invaders attempted to destroy all evidence of technology, occupation, and culture, that mob were here, are here, that we built, lived, and loved here. They did their best to rub an eraser over the land and claim it as their own. Remains and cultural objects stolen were taken to museums all over the world or kept in private collections. But Aboriginal people knew they could never destroy everything. Traces, connections, sovereignty remained, and all will be returned in time.
Well, thank you, Ellen. Our next writer is David Ritter. David is the CEO of Greenpeace Asia Pacific. He holds honorary appointments with Sydney University and the University of Western Australia, and his most recent book was The Cold Truth. David will be reading from his chapter, Loving.
Thanks, Tony, and just to acknowledge that I'll be reading from Gadigal country. Foundational to love is what you choose to notice. Apart from the headlines of disaster and tweets of outrage, there are other things in the mornings too, even on the days of heaviest smoke. life flowing into your body with the first conscious breath and stretch. Even though we live in the inner city, the first noises I hear at daybreak are the squawks and chirrups of the remaining birds. Then there is the infinite nourishment of sleepy conversation, hugs with my partner and kids, or if they're asleep when I get up to leave for work, kisses delivered to slumbering cheeks. Loving those closest to you in these years of ecological crisis has added weight, but this is capable of expression with the deepest tenderness and is an infinitely renewable resource of resolve. I'll just pause while the inner west flight path clears its way. Children, animals, and flight paths. James Bradley said to me once that having children puts a floor on your despair, but I think the presence of kids in your life also creates a vaulted ceiling lit with the promise of what is yet possible if we can get our act together. In our tiny front garden, strange things are happening as the weather behaves unnaturally, but every day I witness the sublime of nature in dogged persistence as I head off to the bus. Last year, a seed planted itself in a pot. We didn't know what the plant was, but we decided to let the plucky seedling be, and it has grown into a sapling maybe 4 foot high, with parakeet green lanceolate leaves covered in fine thread-like trichomes. I noticed a few months ago that a bright emerald common garden katydid was resting in the upper leaves. The creature was present for a week or more, and I assume was responsible for the grasshopper's breakfast-sized holes that began appearing in the foliage. I took to exchanging glances with the katydid each morning, the animal's bulging butter eyes with black pupils glancing back with intersectine superciliousness over the top of long green antennae. The memento mori are now all about us, but so too are the memento vivere. In the midst of the summer of fire, a single Christmas beetle, the only one I have seen this year, flies through a slight gap in the window and lands directly in my lap. I can't help but imagine the creature as a tiny Pheidippides, and I swear a silent oath that we are coming. I'm going to skip forward a couple of passages to finish. Love commands that we do our utmost to achieve a world of future flourishing every day, whatever our situation. There are many years of bad news ahead, so much is locked in and clear. We must be braced and resilient, kind in our stoicism, creative in our determination. It will take monumental effort and take the work of millions of human hands, but we can get there through all the disasters that will come. We can still secure the conditions for recovery and regeneration. We human beings, when we work together, can achieve practically anything. Let's make it a green peace. In the name of love, we can yet do this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. Our next author is Jane Rawson. Jane is the author of From the Wreck, A Wrong Turn at the Office of Unmade Lists, and Formaldehyde, and the non-fiction book, The Handbook, Surviving and Living with Climate Change. Jane is writing a new novel about witches and fascists, funded by grants from the Copyright Agency and the Australia Council for the Arts. I really can't wait for that one. And Jane will be reading from her chapter, But How Are We Supposed to Have Any Fun?
Thanks, Tony, and thank you also to David and Ellen for your great readings. I'm coming to you from Lutruwita, also known as Tasmania, the traditional lands of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people. I love the bourgeois products of humanity: books, films, music, architecture, travel, wine, coffee, fashion. I love all of it. I hear that a lot of environmentalists loathe humanity and its accomplishments, but I'm not one of them. Humans invented train travel and fountain pens, a winding path through a meadow and a small wooden bridge over a chattering rivulet. Humans invented the double bass and custard tarts. Humans invented velvet, bias-cut dresses, the Chrysler Building, perfect Manhattans, picnics, preserved lemon, and sleeping in. Humans invented mixtapes. We have a lot to be proud of. For most of my life, I have lived among the glorious fruits of human invention. Canberra's joyous 1990s DIY music scene, San Francisco's headlong online creativity at the turn of the century, Melbourne's adorably starry-eyed, self-infatuated food and literature obsession. And now, suddenly, I don't. I left Footscray and moved to regional Tasmania. Sold up, priced myself out of the market, packed my things, and I can't go back. I live in the bush now, where everything is a drive away, unless by everything you mean trees, birds, small jumping marsupials, and the mountain wreathed in mist until 11 in the morning. But I am not the outdoor type. I like to walk home a little drunk along city streets, smiling at the antics of passers-by and flagging a taxi if I get too tired. I do not like to walk through scrub, hour after hour, with the sun flaking my skin and tiny flies climbing into my nostrils to drink my snot, and then die in the bush if I get too tired. So maybe I should say, let me tell you about the things I have lost, my dreams, and being me. You know those apartments on the Upper East Side of Manhattan? The ones with the picture rails and the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, faded Persian rugs and deep wooden windowsills. The kind of place you might sink into your armchair in front of a roaring fire to sip a glass of Syrah while you read the latest Ali Smith. The smell of homemade bread wafting from the kitchen. That kind of apartment. That's what I should have left Melbourne for. That was the next logical step. Not a falling down cottage at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by trees in the south of Tasmania. The problem was, though, that I had become more and more afraid of the world that humans were building. I was more and more disgusted by my part in it. We were heading for a time when almost everything would be human, the perverted climate and the animal-denuded landscapes. Human endeavour looks so much more beautiful when it appears in shining islands among a world mostly natural, an adornment to all the other wonders that the earth provides. By itself, it starts to look a bit gaudy, a little bit much. I'd recently written an essay for Meanjin about a topic that was bothering me, the death of wild animals. Not extinction so much, but precipitous drops in the numbers of nearly every animal on Earth, while the numbers of humans and of cows, sheep, and chickens, definitely chickens, rose and rose and rose. In the course of my research, I was finding over and over again that there were almost no animals left on Earth who weren't us or the animals that we'd bred to serve us. It affected me. I tried to change my life to minimize the harm I was causing to wild animals. I stopped buying new clothes or food I wasn't really hungry for. But when it came to giving up books, they're unnecessary, right? I balked. I love books. I read about 100 of them a year. I get heaps from the library and others secondhand, but I probably buy 50 new books every year. And wine. I definitely buy wine. Perfume. I go to see bands. I listen to their music online and on vinyl. I drink coffee, also tea. I take trips, and some of them are to places where the roads are strewn with dead creatures. I realize that everything I love to do destroys the world. All those wonderful things that make me so happy to be alive are making everything else dead. I sat in an overpriced cafe in a Melbourne laneway and I drank a batch brew coffee, and I actually cried because I realized I couldn't be a part of this anymore. Not laneways or batch brew coffee, not buying a gorgeous new dress off the internet, not anything. I cried because I was out of choices. And then I went somewhere where the things I love to do weren't. At least I thought, I'll be safe. Thank you.
A very cryptic note to end on there. Thank you very much. So we'll move into some questions. All of the authors have been very concise and timely. So we do have quite a lot of time left, at least half an hour. So to the audience, if you have a question for the authors, please do type it in to the chat, but I have a few to get things going. I've got at least one for each author, but a couple of general ones that I might start with. And the first I wanted to ask you all about narrative and about what this brings to the situation, because I was thinking of two particular things. One is Amitav Ghosh's contention in his book of a few years back that the bourgeois novel was somehow passé in the era of climate change and the Anthropocene. And then also the way in which, for people like me, the Anthropocene is a discourse in earth system science and climate science and philosophy and the humanities, although it's also creeping into politics and law. But it's also developing a much bigger presence in film and literature, from Blade Runner 2049 to James Bradley's Ghost Species or Jenny Offel's Weather. And then it's also weirdly absent from Westworld, where the final series just assumes that modernity is going to continue unabated. So my question is, what do you think about Ghosh's contention that the novel needs to radically change, that its older form and purpose is passé? And is there something about fictional poetry or just the form of narrative that can deliver us a different perspective? And did that influence, was that a presence when you were writing? Just jump in.
Shall I have a go? I guess, yeah. That Amitav Ghosh quote comes up a lot. And he, I guess as part of that, he said that no novels you can take seriously consider climate change or consider the Anthropocene. And so sort of undermined his own argument immediately by saying basically anything that covers this is not a good novel. So I think a lot of writers have already commented on that and talked about how I guess there are a lot of different ways of writing about this. I mean, there's the more obvious sort of sci-fi kind of options of taking on a far future that's an apocalypse and talking about the breakdown of society. And I think a lot of writers are nervous of doing that sort of thing. They're not comfortable writing fiction that's that speculative, and so they avoid that. But more and more now we're seeing contemporary realist novels that are starting to grapple with this. Like you said, things like Jenny Offel's Weather, and Lucy Trelaw's book Wolf Island, I think is extremely contemporary and talks about climate change, talks about the Anthropocene. So yeah, I think it's something that authors are coming around to and feeling more comfortable with writing as they're starting to see how it affects their own lives and the lives of people around them. For me, I write about it because it's the thing that I'm most interested in, and my only way of expressing myself is through writing, mainly through fiction. So this is what I do. Someone else have a go now.
David, perhaps I could press you on that, because The Cold Truth is very much a non-fiction book. It's analytical, it grapples with policy, but you also bring a narrative, a first-person narrative into that book, and then that first-person narrative is really strongly present in the piece that you wrote in this book.
Yeah, well, I mean, the death of the novel is obviously something that's been proclaimed often enough over the years, and I think probably as someone who knows nothing really about these things, just as a reader of novels, I imagine that the form is robust enough to cope with most things and has been through enough revolutions over the years. Really, when coming to write about these things, whether in The Cold Truth or in the piece in this absolutely extraordinary collection, just look, a round of applause to the editors for just corralling, 46 existentially challenged authors into managing to put this extraordinary collection together. So a huge thank you to the authors. But I think when coming to that, it had just reached a stage where very clearly facts and figures had not cut through. And we had the remarkable moment in the opening of the Olympics in Brazil, where they essentially beamed to a viewing audience of 1 billion people or something the best graphs and graphics that anyone could think of, and of course it didn't actually shift anything. least not directly. And this general turn to a recognition that it is stories as much as facts and figures that will drive change. And this is my vocation, my work, my calling, my life. But it's not just a job. It is what I wake up with in the mornings, and when I try and wanting to communicate that in terms of personal narrative and in terms of that frame of love, is a bid to try and bind these things together in a way that has maximum honesty, maximum truth, and maximum impact.
Yeah, thanks very much. Does Cameron or Ellen have a comment on that one? All right, well, let's move on. I wanted to ask about another strong kind of presence in the book, which is what I call a kind of ecological consciousness. I've been finding that in much of the social sciences and government, even in something like international environmental law, which is supposed to be about addressing the challenges of the Anthropocene, there's a very instrumental, extractive, or in the words of Val Plumwood, a hyper-separated view of our relation to the earth and the natural world. But throughout this book, I think one of the most powerful things is this deep connection and depth the authors feel to nature, to animals, rivers, reefs, and country. I think it'd be great to have all of you comment about what that means for you as writers, what you think it means for society more broadly. Is there a challenge in sort of making this consciousness more prevalent and influential? And would that be a kind of wellspring of hope and possibility in the Anthropocene?
Hi, Tony. Yeah.
Cameron?
Yeah. I certainly think that there's it's really tough to build that connection, that ecological connection to the places around you, because we don't get enough time to reflect and do it, to spend time and learn that ecological literacy. I think it's, especially in cities where most of us live in Australia, there's all that sort of infrastructure around where we get our resources from and where we send our waste is sort of hidden. It's designed that way. It's hard to know the sort of the local effects and the broader global effects, how they're all interacting, and you're part of these bigger systems. So I think it's something that people are starting to get more interested in and learn more about, but it'll take a long time to develop that ecological literacy.
Jane, do you have a comment?
I'd really like to hear from Ellen, if Ellen is still there. Are you still there, Ellen?
Yes, I am. Yes, I'm getting distracted by this conversation in the Zoom chat. It seems like there's quite the discussion going on, and I wonder if we want to respond to any of the questions in here. It's just.
Is there one in particular that struck you, Alan?
No.
All right. Well, while I've got you, I'll place a question to you, because one of the things that was really powerful about your piece was the way you stated the Aboriginal clan and place names at the outset as the first and proper names to place. And then later you ask, what would a post-human world mean in an Aboriginal way? And I think a lot of us strongly feel that the history of the Anthropocene and its future are deeply entangled with the dilemmas of settler colonialism, dispossession, the refusal of Indigenous law and sovereignty and rights to country, what you've talked about as narrative terrorism. And I think Australians, Americans are very reluctant to grapple with this issue. How do you see these issues playing out now? What kind of change would you like to see people taking to grapple with them?
Yeah, it's a really hard question. I think when I was thinking about what would a world with no humans mean in like our way, I was thinking about how the beautiful piece that my auntie wrote about, I think it's the lyrebirds, how they sing in Yugambeh, like birds sort of have language that's it's not just we got to think about like non-human language in the way that country, and we use country to talk about animals, plants, land, water, air. It's not just land, it's things under the land, above the land. It's everything, and it includes us. So if we sort of think in that non-human way, that country is like a container of knowledge, and it continues with or without us, and these ways and these narratives continue without us. And so it sort of made me kind of feel less like nihilistic about the future, to know that this will remain in its own way, even though so much has been lost in such a short amount of time. And so when we think of knowledge transfer, we can also think about the digital space as, even though it has its sort of negatives, it's also been a very positive place for engaging like new generations. And like I have the Yugambeh language app on my phone, which is just it's sort of a very handy way. There's just so much that's in the technology space that's good for younger generations to start to pick up tools that will help them in the future. I remember even there's a project where they were getting sort of like robots in the medical field to be able to speak different languages, particularly in remote areas, which is like really interesting when we think of like AI, like knowing language and culture. Like what does that mean? Like it sort of like opens up this huge like philosophical question about like who language and culture belongs to. So yeah, I'm kind of really thinking about that. And it's also like about a lot of non-Indigenous people that want to learn language. And I encourage that as long as it's not at the expense of First Nations people learning their own language, because I know from experience that many First Nations people, they have lost so much, and they have memories of not being able to practice their culture, learn their language. And then when they see a non-Indigenous person do like a greeting or acknowledgement in language, they sort of start to feel, it makes them feel like not validated because they never got the opportunity. And so, and sometimes people are not aware of just how brutal and violent colonization has been and continues to be, that that they may have passed judgments on people of not being able to for not knowing as much. And it's sort of like, well, no, like, do you know your history? So yeah, for me it's sort of like just thinking about a place where First Nations peoples feel empowered and feel like they own their knowledge, they own their archives, and they know they own the path forward. And then we can get like non-First Nations colleagues and peers to to be behind us on that journey.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really powerful element of your chapter, the way, okay, we're familiar with talking about Aboriginal land rights and rights to negotiate and mining and all of that, but to talk about that right to knowledge and culture and talk about the history of dispossessing people of that and refusing to hand it back added something really different and new. The other really fascinating thing was the way you talked about descendants. As we know that many societies, especially Indigenous societies, venerate ancestors, but you're in a sense saying we need to venerate and be responsible to our decestors in a way.
Yeah, totally. I think that's what it's sort of like it's part of our culture, and it's a meditation on time being very circular and non-linear in the way that we think about things. And so I do what I do for my ancestors, but also for the ones that have not been born and will carry that legacy. And I hold both in my mind, and I think that's how a lot of us kind of think and feel as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. There was a question in the chat that arose out of your talk around, and I think my earlier comment about, do we really need to rethink what it means to be human? What would that imply? And I think part of what a lot of people are trying to talk about is something that Indigenous people always knew and the moderns are just rediscovering, which is that deep human connection with the earth and the agency of the earth, that we're not separate from it, that we don't dominate nature, that it's not there for our use and extraction. But that's a pretty profound philosophical shift. Another question that's come up in the chat and that I think was very clear throughout the book is about the question of hope and despair. Much of the reading in the book is hard. The emotions are raw, the grief is palpable and ongoing, and loss sometimes seems endless. And this morning in The Guardian, you have Joel Gurgis writing, "I'm anxious about the enormity and the scale of what needs to be done, afraid of what might be waiting in my inbox. Something inside me feels like it's snapped, as if some essential thread of hope has failed." But David's chapter, maybe David could start, but I'd really like to hear from all of you, brings a kind of analytical and determined view. It's about planning and determination and conviction. So the question is, how do we stave off despair and cynicism and find some agency at a time like this? Because things are probably going to get harder.
Well, yeah, look, if that was directed to me first, I think that's certainly the central question of my own contribution, and no doubt that of others too. And there's no doubting the enormity of what we face, of course, but hope is not passive nor wishful. And we are able, I think, as complex people, and I'm sort of following the wonderfully rich chat conversation, and yes, people are spiritual and people are greedy and people simultaneously create and destroy. We are crooked timber. We are multiply multivalent complex beings, but we know that human beings working together are capable of just about anything. So in a sense, the best scientific predictions of how grim things might or are likely to become almost fall away if you conceive of your participation in all of this as doing your absolute best according to your own ability to influence at its maximum, and to do so with joy and with kindness. And if one follows that path, in a sense, it is both liberating because you cannot bear the whole of the world upon your shoulders, but also liberating because it gives you a bridge to cross.
I think that's pretty much what I would have said also, David, though maybe not quite as eloquently as you did. You've had some practice saying this. For me, it's stopped, I guess, a while ago being a question of hope or despair, or of anything, I guess, to do with my feelings about this. I've kind of had to put that aside. Most of the time I feel terrible despair about the whole thing, but that doesn't matter because, you know, there's work to do, and it's good work, and it's some of the best stuff that I can do as a human, to think about this and care about it and write about it and provide solace to other people who need encouragement to do it, sometimes to punish my enemies. And I think, yeah, what David was saying about finding joy in doing that, it's one of the best things we can hope for, I think, to take on this struggle and to embrace it and to do it joyfully and kindly. It's not going to stop the atmosphere changing. You know, that's done. We've done that. But it's still worth doing. So yeah, that's kind of how I approach it.
There are a couple of lines in your chapters that really made me think of these issues. Jane, you talked about, quoting Francis Flanagan, saying that the struggle with climate change is narrowed to be about things I was supposed to say no to, rather than the grand existential puzzle of what to say yes to. So I'm feeling that it's about what we say yes to. David has a great line about we're not giving into the inevitability of despair, but understand the truth is our operational terrain and get to work. Really nice line there. In the chat, there was a discussion happening about whether narrative changes things, or is it social movements that refuse to be fobbed off and co-opted and exhausted? I get the feeling, particularly listening to Ellen talk before, that there's a connection between the storytelling and social movements, that you're not going to get change without solidarity and real struggle, but stories are a key part of that. Cameron, when you were editing, did you feel the weight of this kind of despair versus hope problem, or is it a false opposition?
Well, I'm not known for my hopefulness, and and Jenny and Kirsten were really keen to get stories of, you know, practical responses to dealing with this. So you could, you know, give really, you know, all these stories along the lines of David's piece. All right, you know, the systematic things you can do, these really practical things you can do on your own level that will build up to, you know, a nationwide level sort of movement sort of thing. But all the submissions were sort of grieving and elegiac, and we thought, well, you know, if that's how people are feeling, that's what the book has to be. That's what it has to include. And but as you read the book, and if you spend any time thinking about how people are feeling about this, and despair and grief and hope, people, as David said, people are complex, and there is no right or wrong emotion to have. And there is often, stories you see in the media from time to time saying you shouldn't feel this or you shouldn't feel that, that hope's useless or that despairing is useless. But instead of telling people how they should feel, I think our approach was just acknowledge how people feel, and that you can feel hope and despair at once, and grieving is actually probably a really important and the right response to what's happening around us, especially after 2 billion animals being killed in the fires. I think the grief is totally appropriate response to that. And then you come together around those shared feelings and you enable conversations around those. And that's what builds strength and solidarity. And that's how you start to get a picture of what's happening, the magnitude of it. Others are with you. That feeds into social movements. I think that's all connected in a way. And it is, that's the sort of framework we had for the book.
Yeah, and can I just say, Cameron, it was a really great experience for me to write about what I was feeling, and I'm really honoured to have been part of the book and the project, and I'm really kind of proud of the piece as it turned out and to be alongside the other pieces. So I just wanted to thank you and the other editors.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, we were really so pleased you could be a part of the book, and it is a really complex position, your piece, to be dealing with, like, having faced catastrophe or apocalypse already.
Yeah.
And then to be seeing it happen around to the people who are just experiencing it now, and to think about from that position, how do you deal with that legacy and create something for the future that's better. Yeah,
Totally. Yeah.
I think we've got probably time for another question. And I talked about settler colonialism as a kind of grand system that is standing in the way of change. And there's a lot of talk in environmental policy circles about sustainability. And it can turn into a very technical discourse when I think the settler colonial situation suggests that until Indigenous people have justice and autonomy and sovereignty, sustainability won't mean anything. And you can't really achieve a sustainable society. There's another question here about capitalism, this big structural context. Can it really be the kind of system that enables us to grapple with the Anthropocene and cooperate and work together, or is it something more destructive? Do you have any thoughts about that really big one?
surely that's one for David.
David looked like he was going to talk, so I didn't start.
Well, no,
Go, David.
No, you should go, John. I was just actually going to ask Tony who he was directing that to.
I guess my answer would be that
I've been very laissez-faire.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jane, go.
Yeah, sure. I definitely feel like we can't fix it within this framework of capitalism. It's a system designed to maximize profit by extracting value cheaply from whatever is there, which includes obviously the environment and people who are disadvantaged. And it's just, it's never going to function to fix this. But I don't know enough to be able to propose an alternative economic system. I just feel very strongly that this isn't working. It's working for very few people.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'd just add that the current system is clearly broke. There are multiple ways of configuring states and markets. State socialism had a fairly lousy environmental record as well. We need to reconfigure the relationship of states and markets so that peoples and the biosphere, life on Earth, are centred. I mean, for a great schematic of how one might do that, Jane Rawson's book Donut Economics gives a really nice primer to it. Sorry, Kate Woolworth.
Yeah. And that has a presence in that great little film 2040, which is, on the more hopeful side of looking at the challenges that we face, but also the possibilities that might be in front of us if we really are serious about change. Do any of the authors have a final comment you'd like to make?
I'd like to echo what Ellen said and thank Cameron for the chance to write this, and the other editors, of course. It was the piece that I wanted to write was kind of uncomfortable and unpleasant, and I felt like it didn't really fit with the narrative of the general narrative of talking about the Anthropocene or about climate change or extinction. So yeah, I really appreciate that you made space for sort of more difficult, less clear pieces from people who are conflicted about everything. So yeah, thank you for that.
Just 2 words from one of the side chats going on. Onwards together.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much to Jane and Ellen and David and Cameron, to New South Books for allowing us to hold this event and for putting such a wonderful collection together. And also a thanks to Jess and the team at the UNSW Grand Challenges for their support pulling this event together. It's been a fascinating conversation. Go ahead and read this book and take something away from it and get active. So thank you all. Good day.